Welcome back to Caribbean Business Review. I'm Joseph Cox, and today my special guest is Dr. Devon Gardner, who is a senior partner at the Institute for Innovation and Growth. Now, today we are going to be having a conversation about basically power transitions within this region. We need to frame our discussion today. One would be very mindful of the fact that the government of Jamaica has announced that it will not be renewing the license held by the utility or the power monopoly, the electricity monopoly, Jamaica Public Service Company, when it expires in 2027. But the fact of life is that in the interim, a number of imponderables are there, because whereas the government has indicated it might be looking to negotiate or renegotiate with new players, basically, I don't know that the door is completely closed on the current provider. But at the same time, there are some issues that we have to explore as to whether or not, what are some of the challenges that are likely to obtain. What is the regional experience been so far? We are mindful of some stuff that has happened in Barbados, in Belize, and indeed they have some other arrangements that are occurring in several other of the islands. So, Devon, as I welcome you to the program, my question, I suppose, fundamental question is, from your perspective, what are the real implications of the government of Jamaica indicating at this stage, I suppose this was its statutory duty, but indicating at this stage that it will not be renewing the license? What does this mean legally, institutionally, and frankly speaking, politically, as you look at the changing dynamic?
Yeah, thanks, Joseph, and good day to all the listeners and viewers. So, really, the government had three options before when it comes to the license. Option one is you renew the existing licenses, and we continue with the status quo. Option two is you seek to negotiate terms and conditions with the existing utility with JPS and seek to do the renewal but with modifications to the terms and existing terms and conditions. And option three is what the government has chosen, which is to pretty much indicate that it will not renew the license. So the option three of not renewing the license allows the government now to design and license from scratch and to determine whether to negotiate that new license with JPS or other players. So that is really what is ensuing. Now, the reason why the government has taken option three is that the existing license is 20 odd years old, over 25. It's about 25 years old. It's 2001 license. In 2001, Jamaica had very little renewables in the system. What we could consider renewables which Jamaica had in the power system to be marginal in 2001. It had like very small hydro, 5 megawatt hydros, 2 or 3 of those, and small 200 kilowatt turbines in Monroe. Fast forward to 2025, Jamaica has significant amount of wind. 3 phases of Wigton and BMR wind farms, and then it also has 2 major solar utility scale solar facility, and it's now in the process of negotiating 2 additional large scale solar facilities, and is going to be auctioning very soon much more solar facilities, not to mention what is existing on the distributed side of the system, which is like rooftop PV and that kind of thing. So the landscape has changed significantly in terms of how energy is being generated within Jamaica. And if you look at the way the power system operates in respect to what technology allows people to do, customers to do, as well as generators or independent power producers to do in terms of how they interact with the JPS grid. It's a much more dynamic field of play. That's why Jamaica has shifted from, least cost expansion planning to generation expansion planning to where they are now with integrated resource planning. That way, they capture the myriad of what you call players who are actively engaged in the production and use of power. Of course, JPS in the middle still have the license as the sole transmitter and distributor and seller. So there are are a lot of things. I mean, even on the distribution side, there are many operators on the distribution side who could probably distribute and sell electricity more efficiently and more cost effectively than JPS. But the license doesn't allow them to do that. So there are people who are operating on the distribution side and doing leasing of equipment, solar PV, battery energy storage, and those kind of things to large customers. And because the prohibition of sale doesn't allow them to sell, so what they do is they pretty much design and build solar and rooftop or ground mounted solar system and battery storage and other enablers of electricity production and consumption. So these are treated as self-consumption projects. So you're really constrained by the fact that you can only do self-consumption projects. The financing is what you are really, in a sense, allowed to be flexible on. So the changes which have ensued in the last 25 years in terms of technologies overall globally, in terms of the paradigm shift in thinking regarding how the power sector should be operating to facilitate sustainable development, growth, and climate resilience. The way in which we see different players and different stakeholders emerge in articulating and demanding how they want to participate in the power sector is requiring us to really take a deep, hard look at the licenses of operators across the region and to determine whether or not the existing licenses are really serving the purpose of the sector and the purpose of those who it is intending to serve, which is the customers ultimately. So that is really why I think that the decision that Jamaica has took to say, let's just get rid of this, just get rid of the tax on the table and just build something anew. Sometimes when you have a property with a house on it and you look at the house and when you start thinking of what would be required to reconstruct that house or rehabilitate that house to make it the way you want it, you realize it makes no sense. It's better to just knock down the whole thing and start building from scratch where you have better.
I hear you on that, but you see, part of the challenge with it, and I'm glad you raised the issue of the energy mix, because clearly that is something that we have, as you move forward, you would have, in any country, you have to be looking at. But one of the challenges two challenges, one that I see coming up, dependent on how this actual exiting from the contract or from the non-renewal of the license is handling. One, if it is handled badly, it could end up in a legal process, in arbitration. But the other question or the other aspect of it is that with the flawed distribution system that you have now, and the line losses is one aspect of it, but the theft that obtains, in terms of any new player or any negotiation that is going to be, I would presume would have commenced already. How much effective latitude do you really have, one, in terms of the negotiation, and two, when you are looking at something of this nature, what happens in the interim? Is it that JPS could stop investing now? God forbid there is a hurricane that goes into Jamaica. Does that, they lay down arms? What happens now?
So let me start with the last question first.
Okay.
The license continues until July 2027. JPS therefore has obligations that it must meet until the expiration of its license. So JPS cannot down tools and say, look, our license will not be renewed, and therefore we don't care about how we take you to the end of the road, which is until the end of the existing license period. There are obligations that JPS has under the existing license that they must fulfill. Otherwise, any arbitration, as you say, or any kind of litigation would be against JPS and not done by JPS. So they have obligations that they must meet, and the OUR is there to ensure that the licensee meets its obligations under the license for the remainder of the license. And that's going to be important, that the OUR, which is the Office of Utility Regulations, which is the regulator in Jamaica, pays attention to that, ensuring that the quality of service and the cost of service is properly managed as JPS exits the fray. And as you rightly say, that doesn't necessarily mean that JPS will exit the fray. I mean, the fact is, as I said in the beginning, JPS will, as identity, perhaps continue with its generation service. JPS has an IPP subsidiary, which is Southern Jamaica Power Company, that does generation. JPS might decide it wants to continue to do generation, and it remains as an IPP and continues to bid for additional generation opportunities when those arise, and continue to play part of the Jamaican power sector generation landscape. It may exit the grid service aspect of the sector, but or it may actually be able to put enough on the table to Jamaica, to the Jamaican government when the new license emerges, and actually win over the favor of the government with respect to that new license. But interestingly, that new license would obviously require JPS to operate in a different way. It may mean different ownership, different management structures. So the new license does not mean JPS is gone. It's just that the way in which JPS is doing things under the current paradigm is going to obviously shift. So there is nothing on the table at the moment to suggest that JPS is going to simply pick up its marbles and walk away. So the idea that come 2027, JPS is going to be leaving and not therefore be interested in continuing to operate within Jamaica and will already start to figure out how to pack up its bags and go, even as we work towards the negotiation of a new license, is not necessarily the case. So JPS has obligations, existing obligations, and there are opportunities for JPS to continue playing in the sector, whether as a vertically integrated utility or as an IPP generator. So those are things that will happen. Now, I agree with you in terms of the first point raised, in that there are some key reforms that need to be placed on the table and dealt with. And one of those really is the matter of losses, theft, as you referred to it as. And that solution requires a political solution. The point is that there are some parts of the losses that JPS must take responsibility for, and there are other aspects of the losses that JPS must also take. That the government and opposition will have to assist JPS, or whoever it is that is going to inherit the license to solve, because there are parts of it which are socio-political, and we know some of this is with theft. But there is also another piece which is really related to how the license is structured to allow for the types of punitive measures that will discourage theft, because those who know who have been examining the data, even though a lot of it is not necessarily publicly available, but those who have been examining the data and the losses know that the communities that we typically finger in our conversations are not responsible for the majority of the losses or the majority of the theft. A majority of the theft is really coming from those who are bypassing meters, who are bypassing the meters. Not from the trope lines, So there's a bigger issue there, and that would require really serious legislative changes that would allow the law to go after those who are caught and penalize them severely.
But doesn't the law do that now?
The law do that.
Fair.
The law did that, but the penalties are not sufficiently severe to discourage it. So, there are many things that the law do, but the law is not sufficiently robust to discourage it, So if the law is going to give you a fine of 100,000 and you are saving $2 million a year, I'm not saying those are the numbers, but, just speaking anecdotally, then there's not the incentive for you to stop it, is not there, because if you get caught, what you lose by paying a fine is nothing compared to what you gain from the savings. So yeah, it's a major issue. There are also some other issues which would have to be put on the table. And I've listened to Philip Powell, I've listened to Darrell Vaz, and I've listened also to some of the independent power producers and private sector participants in the sector. But there seems to be a consensus that this is a good move, and I also agree that it's a good move. When the price of electricity is hitting 51 US cents per kilowatt hour in Jamaica, we considering the kinds of options that Jamaica has to generate power, it makes no sense, especially when fuel surcharges, which are passed on to customers, is a big part of that. JPS has what we call a right of first refusal, or a ROFA in its license for the existing generators that it has in its fleet. JPS has never replaced one of its existing thermal generators with a renewable generator. As a case in point, even though the utility regulator has already given it permission to do so. So it kind of gives you which is one of the reasons why people, the saying is out there that JPS is not really interested in renewables, because you would think that if you have the right to first refusal to replace your existing generators when they get to their end of life, you would be already seeking to see how you could integrate new modern renewable technologies which are insulated against fuel prices, external fuel prices, in some of these ROFA arrangements, but you're not seeing that kind of shift, and it's not nearly coming as fast as it should. So that just is a case in point that I want to place out there so people to understand. So you have this capacity of generators in the country which are ring fenced for JPS, and those are you cannot be touched by anyone else, because they have the right of first refusal to replace that generation. And if those are not going to be replaced by renewables, then that kind of limits how much renewables the government could bring into the grid. And the JPS generators is a significant amount of the generators that is in the system. So it it makes sense.
No, I understand that, but you see, one of the things that I always recall is that some years ago, the OUR had indicated through when they were doing some prep work regarding electric vehicles, that if 1% of the vehicles that we actually imported into Jamaica were electric, that the grid would have collapsed. The grid could not accommodate. No, the question therefore would be for us, for the Jamaica to move forward, what sort of lead time would a new provider, if it comes to that, how much lead time would they need to actually strengthen the grid, strengthen the capacity for it to really make a meaningful difference? And I mean, from a political standpoint, are the people likely to have the kind of appetite to wait on any kind of learning curve that
No,
is
well,
going to emanate?
yeah, thanks for that question. Well, I agree with you that one of the challenges that people have had, and I mean, even in the post-burial in certain sections of the island, there were certain parts of the infrastructure which went down, and people were annoyed because some of the infrastructure which went down was infrastructure that were, if you want to call them, at risk of failure for a while, and people recognized them as actual points of vulnerability in the grid, and had pointed them out many years ago, and there was limited action taken on those. There most, if you look at how the generation is set up in the region, especially in the terms of in the country in terms of the renewables, most of the renewables is on the south and most of the load is on the north. So there are some conversations around, that need to take place around where to build some of the major substations and how to strengthen some of the assets in the areas where you have the major generators, so that you have lower risk of failures in those areas, and better redundancy. So what is needed to be done on the grid, there is a lot of studies and a lot of understanding in terms of what is required for making the grid more robust. The question is really going to be about how you get in an investor to run the utility. Whether it's the utility is a grid service operator or a vertically integrated utility is another story. But there will need to be that kind of conversation around what type of investor you require. For you to make those kind of changes to the grid, you really need an investor who is in it for the long haul. Now, there are questions around whether the owners of JPS, at least the two foreign owners, were in it for the long haul. There have been conversations around, around for a while, stating that they were looking for sales for JPS. So there have been very few. There have been quite a few people who feel that they were looking more for short-term returns and not so keen on investing in many of the longer-term projects, which is one of the reasons why some of the investments in the grid have not taken place. You kind of need those investments or investors that are in it for the long haul, so that you can amortize the investments in some of the grid assets over the long term, so that the ratepayers are not going to have to front load the cost of that investment. Because if ratepayers have to front load it, you understand what that would mean in terms of the rates which are already high.
Of course.
It's an opportunity to really sit down, craft the license how it wants it, and then to find the type of investor or investors that suit what it is that we need to deliver under the new license.
So, but Devon, let me ask you this. So therefore, if you were advising government, and I'm going to broaden it to the region in a few seconds, but if you are advising government of Jamaica, would you be looking to a concession licensing regime, a performance regime, or a modular regime? Which one would you think would work?
I mean, at this stage, my personal leaning would be to disaggregation of the existing license. I would, not as extreme as Barbados, but something which disaggregates generation from the system operation is one that I think would make good sense, especially given what's happening in Jamaica now in terms of the amount of renewable opportunities which there are, and the opportunities to issue generation license to multiple players in a generation licensing system. You would have to now find ways and means of making it sufficiently attractive for an entity that would operate the grid system and license. Whether or not one of the generators would be allowed, with an entity which holds a generation license would be also allowed to hold a transmission and distribution license is another matter. But there would definitely, the disaggregation of the license should be something that's high in the conversation, in my view. And of course, within that context, looking at performance based regulations to support support the operation of that license. The licensee is something that we always believe is good. We think performance-based regulations is good for the customer and it's good for the utility. You do well, you get rewarded. And if the utility does well, the customer benefits. So performance-based regulations would need to accompany the license. So obviously, with whatever license is emerging from the redesign, obviously the regulations would have to be reviewed, dated to match whatever terms and conditions are emerging in the license, so that there is no dogleg between what the licensor can do and what the regulations are telling you can't and cannot and can do. So that regulatory reform has to come, pretty much right behind in lockstep with the license update that is emerging. So the two things have to walk hand in hand in a sense. So the one
But
thing
Devon, let's be practical. But let's be practical. Sorry, but let's be practical, because one, we all know throughout this region, and this is why I want to broaden it to bring in the other countries or some of the other countries. We know how long it takes for legislative reform. Between the so-called consultation processes that occur, then the various agencies have to get into it to craft the actual language, etc., plus going through the parliamentary process, etc. Sub one is basically 2 years. Is 2 years sufficient for that sort of work, or has it already commenced? For example, in the
I was
case of
about to say, in
Jamaica.
the case of Jamaica, the work has already started, so we're not starting from
Oh,
scratch.
I see.
Yeah,
Okay.
so
Okay.
it's
Okay.
not as
Okay.
yeah, so
But all right.
yeah,
No, fair,
yeah,
fair enough, and I'm glad to hear that.
yeah,
But the other thing then is that when you're looking at something like that, what can we learn from some of the other countries? So, for example, Belize, they nationalized their situation because they're having, seriously regular power supply, a lot of blackouts, etc., etc. Barbados has taken, I think, majority position in the electricity company there. You have places like St. Kitts and so on, who they are using different types of solutions, but it's working in tandem with the current supply. I'm curious. Are there any lessons to learn from that? I mean, government of Jamaica is clear. They said they're not nationalizing it,
yeah.
even though they have a
Actually,
19%
yeah,
stake,
yeah,
but they said they're not nationalizing it.
yeah.
Are there any lessons to be learned?
The question of nationalizing is one that I think there are lots of lessons in terms of what not to do that we could learn. I mean, the countries that have nationalized, which is Belize and Guyana, in a sense, and now Grenada most recently, they haven't made improvements. In the case of Belize had nationalized, but Fortis still ended up having some shares in it anyway. And even though it's nationalized, one could argue that BL is somewhat captive to Fortis, even in its nationalized state. So
But when they nationalized it in Belize, it forced arbitrations. It wasn't a tidy setup at all.
it forced arbitration. In the case of Grenada, it was nationalized through a directive from arbitration. You would recall. So so nationalization. In this instance, it would have been different because Jamaica would not be acting against the run of the license duration. In the case of Belize, the license, there was a license that the utility had when the utility was nationalized. So you would have nationalized while there was an existing license in play. Likewise, that would have been what happened in Grenada, in the sense that in Grenada, there were changes to the license while the license was in play that the utility didn't agree to, and the utility took the government to arbitration, and the decision was made between the utility and the government during arbitration that the government will buy the utility from the private sector investor. So those are different instances. In the case of Jamaica, the license is coming to an end. The government has signaled that it will not renew the license. So if at the end of the license the government were to then that would not require arbitration because it's at the end of the license. But what would be required is obviously looking at the assets and looking at fair price for the assets in respect to the transfer of assets to whoever becomes the new system operator and the new owner of the utility assets. So it's really going to be more a matter of a transactional arrangement that would look at fair value and fair price for the assets. Where the utility would probably put its cost to what it thinks the asset is. Government would look at it and do its own audit and come up with its own price. And then somewhere in the middle, they would have to meet to determine what would be the common price that they would agree to. Yeah. But in the case of Barbados and some of the others, and St. Kitts and some of the others, in terms of how their utility sector transformation and reform is going, I would say Jamaica is way ahead of the majority of them. I mean, Barbados on paper has disaggregated its utility sector license, and it's still continuing to figure out how to stand this up to make it effective. But it has, operationally, there's a lot that they still haven't figured out yet. So on paper, Barbados is quite advanced in terms of its disaggregation of its electricity licenses. But, many of those licenses to date, even the license for battery storage, licenses for, distribution and all of those licenses, because they have chopped up the license into generation, transmission and distribution, storage, and all and all of these things. So there are different, completely different licenses for the various stages within the operation of the utility and of the utility business, and they haven't yet figured out exactly how to really operationalize, even though in law it exists, and they are still working through those nuances. And in the case of places like St. Kitts and Nevis, places like St. Vincent and so on, where the utilities remain nationalized, they are struggling. I mean, in fact, recently we were doing some work with the World Bank, and not the World Bank, sorry, with the Caribbean Development Bank. I was doing some work with the Caribbean Development Bank. And one of the things which emerged, interestingly, is that a majority of the utilities which are nationalized, we have gone through all of the utilities, looking at their, how they're set up. The majority of the utilities that are nationalized in the region are not creditworthy. They have poor creditworthiness. The ones which are JPS are the privately held ones are among the most creditworthy utilities. These are the utilities that tomorrow morning can issue a PPA against their balance sheet without problem. Utilities like Lucelec and JPS and BL&T. And most of the others which have deep public ownership, they are not even worth the PPA on which the paper on which the PPA is written. The PPA being a power purchase agreement. So that's why oftentimes even in some of those countries, when it's time for, when private sector investors wants to put new generation, whether it's renewable generation and so on, into the mix, and even though there are good intentions sometimes by the government and the utilities to accommodate it, it can't be accommodated because a utility that's not creditworthy then requires the government to issue a sovereign guarantee to back the PPA. And in many of these countries, the situation. So these projects are non-starters for that reason. So the creditworthiness of utilities in the region is actually a huge problem. And Jamaica is fortunate not to have that problem, so we need to make sure, that we don't lose in terms of that value of having a creditworthy utility.
That's a very interesting point to make, and it really segues really into the issue of when we're looking at the future. The future, frankly, for this region is that, and for the world, is that artificial intelligence is a future. One of the downsides, I suppose, from artificial intelligence is that it requires immense power supply. You have to up your power supply to meet those sorts of requirements. From where you sit, Devon, you obviously are well read and experienced right across the region. Is this region ready for that? I mean, what is the kind of lead time that one would realistically need to bring the region up to the stage where we can actually start to play in that space, the AI space, in any meaningful way?
Well, I mean, in terms of the energy side of it,
yes, it's energy.
The energy side of it, the region, I don't think the region has a problem per se in terms of the options to be able to produce the energy that is required. Naturally, we have to find ways and means of making that energy production cost effective. Otherwise, we are not going to be able to pay.
It makes no sense.
It makes no sense, and we might as well rely on cloud services from those who are producing energy cheaper. But there are the opportunities and options to do that. The problem is that many of the conversations around energy production in the region and renewable energy development and integration remains at a power sector level, and is just looking at power demand based on existing models of demand forecasting, where you simply take the economic growth, projected economic growth of a country that is coming from the IMF based on the standard, economic model, and then you will look at it in a standard power generation expansion model and say, okay, this is where we are now. We expect growth to be 5% per annum for the next 10 years, and therefore this is how much power we'll need. So it's looking at it through very, very standard lens. So the principle of understanding how the world and this is innovating around us and figuring out how the power demand is going to change. The forecast is going to change based on the new paradigm is not something that we have done well. And thinking about how, to look at the coupling of sectors is still a challenge. There is still an apathy, and many of the people in the power sector are still very traditionalist, very conservative. And there's, and many in the banking sector, unfortunately, are also like that. And so if you're power sector traditionalists and your banking sector traditionalists are lock in step and say, look, we need to see the growth clearly laid out before us before we can start to think about projects that would support. They are not into the build it and they will come kind of model. They are into, we have to see it first before we will put a dollar in it. And
Yeah.
that is the thing, St. Kitts and Nevis is a perfect case in point, because that's an area a country I'm involved in with a lot of work there. And the principle at Nevis as an island is in the process of thinking of and actively working towards developing 50 megawatts of geothermal power and as much as 45 megawatts of solar PV power complemented with battery storage, which means you're looking at probably up to 100 megawatts of renewable energy over the next decade in an island that currently has a peak demand of 11 megawatts. People are laughing and saying this is nonsense. Because they are looking when they view through traditional lens, where on earth will Nevis get the demand to be able to use 100 megawatts of energy? Those are the kind of conversations that are discouraging the decision makers from continuing to do the development at the speed which is necessary for us to have the kind of readiness, because nobody is looking at what we call demand building activities. So when they start demand building activities like, as you said, data centers and hydrogen power generation, and they say, oh, these are pipe dreams and these are pies in the skies. These will, we are never going to get there in the Caribbean. So why are we wasting time and money on these things? Let's just build some solar to meet the domestic demand. Let's just build some geothermal to meet the domestic demand and not waste time on these things like trying to build oversize the capacity so that you can generate some to transmit to other countries through inter-island cables, whether underground or overhead, those kind of things. People are looking at them and laughing at them and say they are pipe dreams. And, these are the things that are holding us back, because we are not prepared. Many of us are not prepared to make decisions that are innovative. And in instances, those who are prepared to do so are being held back by the trappings of those who have influence and are advising those who are decision makers not to go with the things that are unconventional and novel.
Waste of time. I tell you sometimes, but Devon, we have 1 minute left in this conversation. And if you, from where you sit, can you give me probably 2 or 3 strategic recommendations that you would offer to the governments of this region over the next 24 months to really transition this region to the next level in terms of electricity and in fact the whole power space?
Yeah, well, the first recommendation is sector coupling. We need to stop looking at power through just an electricity sector lens. We have to look at it across what we call a multi-sector lens. Look at things like data, look at, and ICT, look at things like hydrogen and electrochemicals as a replacement for petrochemicals, and look at it as a part of a green industrialization. So move beyond just to look at power through the conventional expansion arrangements that seek to meet the existing domestic demand and grow incrementally. Otherwise, we will continue to grow incrementally as countries. And the second is, we have to really try to use those, if you want to call it, use the existing infrastructure, let me call it financial instruments that are available to us globally to prepare ourselves, because there's a lot of financial instruments out there globally that can help us to do. But we tend to only focus those instruments on what with the tried, tested, and proven, and if you want to call it the basic needs. So we are quick to use most of the CDB money and the World Bank money and the IDB money and healthcare and schools and so on. We understand and agree that these things are important, and basic needs and infrastructure for healthcare, education, roads and so on, water and so on are critical, but we must always find ways and means. We have to always find ways and means of putting something in it for innovation and for the futuristic development that will move us from the incremental changes to the real sustainable changes. And finally, the issue of planning and is one that we still need to spend more time on. The issue of integrated planning, we still haven't got there yet. We do integrated planning on paper, but we just really haven't made it a way of life.
Yeah. All right. Well, Devon Gardner, Senior Partner at the Institute for Innovation and Growth, I thank you very much for your time today, sir. And we hope that we'll be able to have further conversations as these things evolve over time. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Have a good day.
All right. Good, good.